interpreting. That being said, without further ado, I want to introduce you Mr. Peter Tse. Mr. Peter Tse, there's a big round of applause for Peter, please. Maybe Mr. Peter Tse needs no further introduction, even though I'll say to you all for shortening, because we're kind of late, that he's one of the most generous and brilliant intellectuals I came across in my life. That being said, let's start and let's hear from Peter Tse. Thanks a lot.
Sorry, Peter, before you start, I also have one thing to say. Of course, I have to thank everyone that Gabriel has already thanked, but overall, I as the co-head of the event, I have to thank Gabriel, and without him, nothing would have been done. He's been working non-stop for 2 years so that the first event and now the second event could happen, sometimes without even sleeping. And I've been witness to his work and his dedication to this. So I'd really like to have a round of applause to Gabriel, because he's really the one behind all of this. And thank you, Gabriel. It's an honor to be your friend. So, Peter.
Well, I want to thank everybody here, but especially Gabriel and Renato for working so hard. I learned yesterday that this is my second time in Brazil. The last time was when I was young, so 25 years ago. And I went to Foz do Iguaçu, which was incredible. And I learned last night over beer that these two have never been there. But then they learned about me that I have never been to Niagara Falls, which is kind of near my house. So I think it's very common to neglect the beauty that is in your backyard. Yeah, so I see myself, if we can see my laptop. Let's see. I think you have to switch it. I think it's shared. Oh, stop sharing. Okay, wait, hold on. Oh, stop it and start again. So stop. All right. All right. So again, thank you everybody for allowing me to come down to Brazil. It's just a fantastic place. I came down a couple days early and spent a couple days on the beach at Copacabana and Ipanema. I just love it here. It's beautiful. So today I want to give essentially the second half of the talk I started in, was it June or July? July. And so I'll begin with a, oh, does it work? Oh. Now this is not working. We're having lots of technical problems. Let me try. Stop share. Let's try again. Okay. We have the usual technical. All right, so I'm going to begin with a recapitulation of my talk from July. I'm sorry. I'll begin with a recapitulation of my talk from June, July, very quickly to remind people what the first half of the talk was about. So I argued, along with other people, that we should make a distinction between proximal free will and distal free will. And we can make this distinction between picking and choosing. So in picking, you just pick something essentially arbitrarily. So you say, well, I want an apple. All the apples are essentially equivalent. So you choose one on the basis of what's most convenient. There's no consequentiality to it. It's not important. You simply choose one. This is called picking. Choosing is different in that we usually have some reasons to choose one thing over another. For example, we might want milk and we want it to be organic and cheap. Should I hold it closer? Yeah. Okay. So we want it to be, organic milk or cheapest milk or made locally, and so we'll weigh the pluses and minuses of our reasons, and we'll choose this milk versus that milk because the milks are actually different. So then there's a particular kind of choosing that is about choosing distal events. We're choosing what future to strive for. Do we want to become a professor or a lawyer or a doctor? We choose and we deliberate, sometimes for months or years, in an attempt to optimize a kind of dream. And this kind of deliberation is very distal. And yet this is really the most important kind of domain of free will. So the focus, for example, in the Libet paradigm, of moving your hand in an instant that has no consequence, that is not meaningful, is really not the domain of free will in ordinary life. The most important domain of free will is the domain of deliberation, planning, and striving for a kind of future, including a new kind of future self in some cases. So in this case, where we deliberate about ourselves, we form a vision of what we want, perhaps 5 years down the line. And we think, okay, that's my goal. What must I do in order to accomplish this? Okay, I must take a test to get into college. I must study, this and this, and then eventually we're admitted, and after 5 years we get a PhD. So it's a long process. So free will in this kind of situation is slow. We can call this slow free will. It's based on deliberation and imagination and long-term effort, where we make mistakes and we correct ourselves and we try again, and we're always driven toward the goal. So one theme of today's talk is that basic ideas in our domain, like luck and free will, are not happening in an instant, but they're happening over long durations, including feedback in a cybernetic process that allows us to correct our mistakes and continue on. So I made a distinction in July about first order free will, which we have in common with most mammals. And I can define that as, if a mind can alter the probabilities of future events for its own reasons, and if it can knowingly choose among alternatives, some of which might really happen, then we can say that this mind exhibits free agency or has a free will. Now, some people don't like the word free will, so we can forget that word if you want, but really we're talking about deliberation, volitional selection, and then realization of what we envisioned. So even a jaguar in the Pantanal, where I will go with Gabriel soon, has a kind of free will. It can imagine a path to the prey, the capybara, and it can think, okay, this way's faster, but louder, but this way's takes longer, but it's more quiet, and it can evaluate internally and then choose one option and then attack the capybara. So it has a kind of Borges-like garden of forking paths in its head. And that's also true for the capybara. And then it attacks and it succeeds. And so there's a kind of internal visualization of the future possibility tree in the mind of the jaguar, also in the mind of the capybara. They can both be wrong, but based upon this internal visualization of possible futures, you act. So there's imperfect correspondence between represented possibilities and actual possibilities, but it's good enough that it allows us to survive in the world. Now, a jaguar or a capybara is very different from us in that they can only envision that for which they have instincts. They're kind of slaves to instinct, whereas we are not. So we have this first order free will, but we also have another kind of free will. Second order free will, which I'll talk about in a second, but even for a jaguar or for us, there's a kind of dynamic interaction between what we imagine, the internal garden of forking paths, we act, we see, oh, we get feedback, oh, that was actually not possible, we'll try again. And what we then choose affects what happens, what becomes real, and what becomes real affects what we then imagine. And so there's a dynamic loop between perception, imagination, deliberation, action, then again imagining, and so forth. So it's a process, it's not an instant. Now, humans are different in that they also have second order free will. We can choose to become a new kind of chooser in the distal future. So for example, I can say next year, I want to be able to speak Portuguese. So I get a book on Portuguese and I practice every day. And then in 1 year, I'm adequate. And in 2 years, I'm fluent. No jaguar says to itself, next year, I want to be a different kind of jaguar. I want to be a jaguar that eats more tapirs and fewer capybara. So they don't have the kind of freedom that we have because they don't have the kind of imagination that we have. And they don't have the kind of ability to suppress or inhibit instinct that we have. Okay, so what is it about our lineage, about our species that gave us this incredible ability to deliberate about new kinds of futures, including a subset that's about ourselves, where we can imagine to be a different kind of person next year, for example, one that speaks a different language, or maybe even one who is more honest. We can think about character changing. So we can return now to the old idea from Aristotle's idea of character formation and what that is. So this whole talk is very Aristotelian in the sense that it advocates the idea of virtue ethics, that we can work slowly towards creating a new self by practicing, and then this becomes a habit. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is really Aristotle's project of habit formation of aspects of character and even consciousness. So where did this come from? Well, our imagination, I argue, is different from that of a jaguar in that we can imagine things that not only are possible in the real world, but are actually even impossible in the real world. And how did this start? Well, that was really the focus of my last talk, was what changed in the brain to allow us to have essentially a different kind of consciousness. So our consciousness, unlike that of other animals, is bifurcated. So our reality is a bit like Google glasses, right? We have a physical, corporeal representation of the world outside and our body in the world, like a jaguar. But in addition, we have this invisible experience of the causes of the apparent. So we're representing invisible other minds, invisible causation, invisible, and so we can create all kinds of invisible realities behind the apparent. There could be gods and so forth. So you can imagine that this gave us tremendous power. So in the example I gave in July, if a lion sees zebra hoof prints, I'll tell you what it will do. It will do nothing because this does not look like a zebra. It doesn't smell like a zebra. But our ancestors, even though we were very weak, could look at this and say, they were going this way, and probably 20 kilometers this way is a great field of grass. They were probably going here. So we could represent the invisible reality behind apparent reality. This gave us a huge advantage, but it also had many negative sides. So I want to argue that this ability to imagine led to this unprecedented kind of behavior. No other animal does anything like this, where we're creating things that don't exist.
but it also led to the possibility of psychosis, especially bipolar depression and schizophrenia, don't have parallels among chimpanzees, because chimpanzees don't have this sort of bifurcated consciousness. And psychosis is really where there's a failure to say, oh, the domain of the imagination, that's not real. If you believe that that's real, you're crazy. But this is something that happens as a consequence of the architecture of our minds. This is the price we pay for having our kind of architecture. So in my first talk, I talked about the reasons for this, and I'll just go over it quickly. I argued that there was a kind of demodularization of the domains over which operators operate on specialized operands. And so now an operator can operate on something for which it was not designed by evolution. So we can take pattern recognition operations from vision and apply them to our memory and see the patterns of our life, or envision death and so forth. So operators were freed up in a kind of promiscuous situation where the brain actually could carry out operations that became freed, but also this could cause real problems. But most importantly, we have brain circuits, in particular the frontal parietal control network and the default mode network, that allow us to have an internal virtual reality, right? So our consciousness allowed volitional operations that were originally evolved to manipulate the body and objects. Now we can do this internally in our internal virtual reality. So our consciousness became quite complicated, right? So whereas, say, a chimpanzee has a representation of the perceptual world and its body in it, as well as some degree of imagination about what could happen in this world, and then also dreams, we have that, all those types of consciousness that a chimpanzee has, plus we have the ability to operate on a kind of internal virtual reality of our imagination, in which almost anything is possible. So this new kind of consciousness allowed. Okay, is this better? Is this better? Okay, my apologies. So this allowed us to imagine futures that allowed us to survive better, right? So if we could not imagine the future, we would run the danger of a garden path. So a garden path happens when locally this is my best option, locally this is my best option, locally this is my best option, and then I get eaten by a lion. In contrast, imagination gave us the possibility of desert paths, where we could say, okay, locally this is terrible, locally this is terrible, locally this is terrible, but at the end of it, I receive a PhD. Okay. So very central to our kind of free will is this long-term imagining. So, of course, we're not utterly free, right? I cannot choose to fly because I cannot imagine myself to have wings. I don't have wings. I don't have the genetic potential for wings. So I can't fly with my body, but I can, for example, learn to fly a plane, right? So what is genetically given is not an outcome. What is genetically given is a potential. And I can take my potential.
That's very Aristotelian.
Yes, this is all very Aristotelian. In fact, I should just let Aristotle speak. Yeah. Anyway, but so your own decisions are part of the environment that will influence in which direction your potential will be realized. For example, being human, I have the potential to speak a new language. Now, most people, especially Americans, never realize that potential. But I can realize that potential in lots of different ways. I can say, oh, I want to learn Mandarin, or I want to learn Portuguese, or I want to learn Swahili, and then I can realize that potential. Now, people have very different potential. Some people, for example, I have very low potential in music, but still I learned to play the guitar. I'll never be Mozart or Jimi Hendrix, but I'm adequate. So I have a little potential. So it's very important to, I think, have a realistic understanding of what your potential is and then to try to develop it. This reminds me of I think this is a Brazilian joke about Argentina, that it is a country with that has great potential and always will. So, of course, there's an Argentinian version of it like this. I won't say what that is. Okay. So we can imagine a very different future, including a different future about ourselves, and then we can set about trying to realize it. But the danger is that we can imagine terrible things, because imagination is our greatest tool, but also our greatest weapon. And it can lead to this. It can lead to this. Right? So you can use your imagination for evil. Our imagination is our greatest weapon in this case. But it can lead to this, and it can lead to this. So in this case, our imagination can be our greatest tool to create a better future. Okay, so now I want to go through various arguments, and I'm going to actually utilize some of my MOOC, because in my MOOC I wasn't wearing a mask. So the luck argument. So now I'll stop talking and I'll talk on the screen. Oh, hold on. Can you get my, let me see if this works. Okay. Gabriel, is it possible to get the sound off of my speaker? If I unmute it, I'm worried that there will be reverberation. Yeah. Anyway, I apologize. I included talks from my MOOC, and I thought that I could simply play them, but now I've messed things up because the speaker has to be switched from this onto my laptop. Share my audio. Okay, I don't know how to do that. Yes. So if I play this, wait. Okay. I can try. It might cause reverberation. So let's see. Oh, that's okay.
So far, we have considered two primary philosophical arguments against the possibility of free will: the consequence argument and the exclusion argument. Now, we'll consider the third philosophical argument against the possibility of free will. This one is called the luck argument. It rests on the idea that there are two kinds of luck: First, there's the good or bad luck we had in being born with the constitution that we have, with our particular genetics.
But what I could do is I could just
can create
talk.
that fosters or harms us and our
Okay.
development. We can't be held responsible for or the genetics that we inherited, since we did not choose these things. They just happened. And we had to cope with the hand that we were dealt with in life. Let's call this kind of luck constitutive luck. Besides
Hello?
constitutive,
I apologize.
we can call
Testing.
Alô, alô. Alô, alô.
So far, we have
Hello, hello.
considered
Hello.
two primary philosophical arguments against
Hello.
the
Yeah, I mean, you want to transfer the sound from this to the Zoom.
exclusion argument. Now, we'll consider a third philosophical argument against the possibility of free will. This one is called the luck argument.
Okay, it says you're sharing sound from the computer.
Kinds of luck. First, there's the
Hello?
good or bad luck we had in being born with the constitution that we have, with our particular genetics, into a world that we didn't create, that fosters or harms us and our development. We can't be held responsible for the world we were born into, or the genetics that we inherited, since we did not choose them.
Okay, that's the only important.
They just happened. And we had to cope with the hand that we were dealt with in life. Let's call this kind of luck constitutive luck. Besides constitutive luck, there's a second kind of luck that we can call present luck. Let's say we decide, just by chance, to go jogging around the park clockwise versus counterclockwise. Let's say a mugger is looking for someone to rob. If, just by chance, we both go around the park in the same direction, we will most likely not meet each other. But if we, again, by chance, go around the park in opposite directions, the probability that we will cross paths is very high. In one case, we encounter the mugger and are attacked, while in the other case, we don't encounter him and are not attacked.
Basically, I'm
In
talking
case,
about
we did not choose to be attacked or not
idea
attacked,
that
so
all
we can't be blamed if we are attacked or not attacked.
fortune
Getting attacked just happened by chance. We either had the good present luck of not running into the
What does
mugger,
this mean?
or we had the bad present
don't see
luck
this.
of running into him. Now, the luck argument against free will runs like this.
Yeah, but I don't see this.
If decisions or actions occur indeterministically, such that two or more
but come look,
alternative
come look,
decisions
I don't
might
see
be
it
made
here.
at a given moment, each with a non-zero probability of happening, and everything is exactly the same in the world's history until that very moment,
So can I
then
explain
there's
this to
nothing
the
about
audience?
the world
And the Zoom people are hearing the
prior to
talk.
that
Okay,
moment
so basically
that
I'm
accounts
saying
for one decision being made over the other.
talking
Which
about the
option gets
argument
chosen
from
is just a
other
matter of,
philosophers like Ulric,
even if it's weighted
many
chance,
others.
just a matter
There
of
is no free
not a
will.
matter of the chooser
Everything is
having
just
an
luck.
influence on the likelihood of
So, for
specific
example, Neil
outcomes.
Levy,
If one
hard
decision
luck
should
talks
turn out to
about
be better or
present.
worse than another, well, it's just a matter of good luck or bad luck, and not a matter of the agent's choice.
Constitutive luck is a little bit
But
like genetics.
if decisions and
If you choose
consequences
genetics,
are just a
which
matter
is
of
lucky
luck,
or unlucky.
then the decider cannot
Then
be held responsible
present,
for the
like
decision he
rolling the
made
die.
or for its
The
consequences.
dice. You want a
That if
6,
the argument from
you might get
works
6,
at
or you
all,
might get 1 or
works
2 or
against
3.
libertarians
What you get is
and also against compatibilists.
this
According
kind
to
of
the luck
argument
argument against free will is
has
ruled
been used by
out by
Neil
luck,
Levy and others.
regardless of the truth
No
of
free will.
determinism or indeterminism.
Whether
This
there's
entails a
determinism
denial
or
that anyone
indeterminism,
bears any moral
everything is
responsibility
just
whatsoever.
So
If
in
this
this
view is
argument,
correct, then
Hitler,
even though
for
Hitler
example,
chose to systematically
well, he cannot be
exterminate
blamed
millions
for
of
having
people, he
his
did so just by
genetics.
luck, whether because of
Maybe
his
he had
inherited
genetics
character,
that
which
made
was his
him
bad
evil,
constitutive
wicked.
luck, which was hardly his fault, or because of his
And then
present
the
luck
other
in
part of the
deciding
argument
between
was,
options
well,
just by
you
chance.
know,
So again,
that he
hardly his fault. Now,
ended up
I
becoming
find this
the
view utterly
chancellor.
wrong,
Well, he
nihilistic,
was
and
lucky
impoverished,
to choose
but there are philosophers who argue
that
this.
he ended up
So let's try to understand the
killing
luck argument a little
6
bit better
million
before
Jews
we
and
try to
60 million
dismantle it.
people. Well, this is also just.
The philosopher
I
Peter
think this
Van
argument is
Inwagen
absurd.
imagines a potential thief
There's a related
pondering
argument by
whether to
Peter
steal from the church or
Inwagen.
not. He's in an emotionally and morally torn state before his decision is made. He feels torn because he's undergoing an internal struggle between two conflicting motives in him. He's torn between his motive to have more money and his conflicting motive to honor a promise that he made to his mother on her deathbed to live a moral life. If he forgoes stealing the money, he forgoes something he desires, namely the money. But if he reneges on his promise to his mother, he also loses something he desires, which is his desire to live up to his mother's expectations and his desire to not break a promise that he made to her. Philosophers who believe in the validity of the luck argument tend to argue that defenders of libertarian free will, like myself, fail to offer any explanation of why it is that the thief decides to steal rather than not steal the money. If he steals, well, stealing just happens. And had the decision, by chance, gone the other way, libertarians, they argue, cannot explain why he refrained from stealing. In that case, not stealing just happens. The genes that the potential thief inherited are a matter of constitutive luck, so he cannot be held responsible for that or for the choices, acts, and consequences that follow because of the character that was foisted on him by his genetics and the environment that he was born into. But whether he chose to steal or not steal comes down to present luck, so he can also not be held responsible for stealing or not stealing, whichever the case may be, and cannot be held responsible for any downstream consequences of his actions either. Two philosophers, Robert Cain and Mark Balaguer, have tried to defend libertarian free will on the basis of such torn decisions. Cain gives the example of a businesswoman who's in a rush to get to an important business meeting. On the way, she sees somebody who needs help. She's torn because one part of her wants to help the person in need, whereas another part of her wants to make it on time to her important meeting. Cain says that whatever she decides, whether to help the person in need or not, will be an act that she wills to be the outcome because there was a part of her who wanted that to be the outcome, whether she helps the person or doesn't. An advocate of the luck argument against free will, such as the philosopher Neil Levy, in his book Hard Luck, would say that this is not a good way to justify free will, libertarian free will or otherwise, because torn decisions just come down to present luck. And if every choice comes down to either constitutive luck or present luck, there can be no moral responsibility, no free will, and no blame. Terrible things just happen. Indeed, that is Levy's view. The Holocaust, for example, on this kind of philosophical view, just comes down to bad luck. I find this view to be both nihilistic and absurd, but I have to give reasons why. In the next segment, I will try to rescue libertarian free will from the clutches of the nihilistic argument that everything that we decide and do just comes down to blameless luck.
To everyone. All right. Testing. Okay. I apologize for these technical difficulties. Yes, so Gabrielle, I would like to be able to switch between this and my speaker. All right. So basically, I think the people on Zoom, I hope the people on Zoom could hear the talk. The people here could not. So let me quickly recapitulate. There's no free will because everything comes down to luck. You did not choose your genetics, and everything else that you choose comes down to essentially an accident. So in the example of Peter Van Inwagen's case, he talked about a thief who desires to steal money from the church. But he also promised his mother, as she was dying, that he would lead a good life and be moral. So now he's torn. I want the money, but I want to be good to, honor my mother. So the criticism from people like Neil Levy is that if the thief chooses to steal, well, stealing just happens. It's like flipping a coin. Or if the thief does not steal, then not stealing just happens. It's like flipping a coin the other way. So there's no location in this series of events where the agent actually made a difference. The decision came down to luck, present luck. And then I talked in this video about two other philosophers, Robert Kane and
Mark
Mark
Gallagher,
Gallagher,
who
who
try to get
tried to get
around
around
this
this
luck
luck
argument
argument
by
by
arguing
arguing
that
that actually
people
people
are
are
conflicted.
conflicted.
So they
So they both want,
for example,
for example, Robert Kane talks about helping a woman, a woman who's going to help a poor person
who needs
who needs their help,
or
or she wants to go to an important business meeting. So she's conflicted, she's torn.
And the argument of Robert Kane then is that no matter what you choose,
No matter what she
whether to help
chooses,
the
whether to
person
help
in
the
need
person in need
or whether
or
to
to
go
go
to
to the business meeting,
she
she wanted this in both cases. So in both cases, it was her desire.
So
I think both Neil Levy's argument
and
and the Kane-Gallagher argument
are
are subject to the fallacy of instantaneity. They believe that events play out and are resolved at an instant. But in biology,
especially
in the brain, most actions, including decisions, are durational. They play out over
seconds
or minutes or hours or years,
and they
and they
involve
involve
feedback.
feedback.
So it's a kind of cybernetic process that allows us to correct our errors in pursuit of some goal. Now, it may be true that positive luck can resolve at an instant, like throwing a die. And certainly, we don't choose our constitutive luck. However, even our constitutive luck is not simply a matter of what we inherited, because what we are depends on how we have shaped our potential. And so visionary luck is a kind of luck that plays out over durations.
Is the kind of luck that plays out over durations.
Okay, now can you hear me better? Okay. So I muted it here. Okay, is that? No, this is, okay. So durational luck plays out as we deliberate about a possible future and we try to realize that goal. So I want to talk a bit about self-forming acts. I was going to show another movie, but maybe I should not. I don't know. It's a little bit risky. Gabrielle, can you allow me to show the movie again?
The philosopher Robert Kane's strategy of grounding libertarian free will in undetermineds is vulnerable to the criticism that it fails to overcome the argument from luck, according to which, if a critical moral choice goes one way versus another due to randomness, then we cannot hold people responsible for the consequences that follow from their random choices. Note that in Kane's grounding of libertarian free will in undetermined torn decisions, there is no higher governing basis for making a choice in a torn decision such as Van Inwagen's thief's decision, deciding to steal and then stealing the cash just happen. Had he decided not to steal from the church box, then not stealing would have just happened. Note that for Kane, the important indeterminacy happens at the moment of choice, not before it. This means that people cannot bias the chance outcome toward the morally superior choice with their wills, because even if they could, their decision to bias the outcome one way versus the other would itself be subject to the argument from luck. Criterial causation offers a way out of the argument from luck. Remember, criterial causation offers a middle ground between determinism, where things cannot turn out otherwise, and utter randomness, where what happens occurs for no reason having to do with our agentic wishes. For example, if the criteria that need to be met are, he's an American male politician, you might have thought, Donald Trump, in part just by chance. But if I could have rewound the universe to the moment where I specified the criteria, this time you might have said, Jimmy Carter. Both answers fully meet the criteria that I set. The outcome was not determined because your answer could have turned out otherwise, but it was not utterly random because it had to be an American male politician. Now, consider a self-forming decision like making a New Year's resolution. We make a decision that we need to better ourselves in some way. We might consider various possible resolutions, say, to be more honest or more kind or less greedy. And once we've chosen a good New Year's resolution, we can set about accomplishing our goal of reforming ourselves. The result of such a decision is not solely a matter of chance or luck, because a good New Year's resolution would have to meet our criteria for a decision that would improve us in some way. Unlike cases of torn decisions like Van Inwagen's thief or Kane's businesswoman, where the decision to steal the money or not, or to help the person in need or not, just came down to present luck, in the case of criterial decision-making, there is a higher but non-determinative governing basis for making a choice. Yes, that the resolution ended up being, say, to be more honest this year, rather than to be less greedy this year, was a matter of luck in the sense that the first proposal passed the threshold for adequate satisfaction of integrity-enhancing criteria first, but it is not an utterly random outcome like choosing to steal the money or not, as in the thief's torn decision, or choosing to help someone in need or go to the meeting, as in Kane's businesswoman example of a torn decision. Under criterial causation, the choice is not utterly random because it had to be an integrity-enhancing resolution. It is also not determined, breaking any chain of sufficient causes that might undermine moral responsibility because a different integrity-enhancing resolution might have won out. The regress is broken by adding indeterminism, but the luck argument is broken by forcing any choice or action to meet criteria set by the agent. Kane's account is vulnerable to the luck argument because there's no basis for choosing one way or the other. And so one set of motives is just randomly favored over the other. On my account, the integrity-enhancing criteria specified by the agent imply that whatever resolution ends up being chosen was willed and was not simply a matter of luck, because the decision or choice had to meet the agent's criteria. Yes, there is randomness in terms of which New Year's resolution will win, but there's not randomness at the level of the basis for choosing one option over another, as in Kane's and Balaguer's undetermined torn decisions. This kind of contingency is almost everywhere you look when you look at life closely. Why am I married to this person instead of that other one? Well, perhaps I turned left that day, just by chance, instead of right. And had I turned right, I never would have even met her. On the other hand, the outcome was not utterly random. In my case, the outcome had to be a woman who met various criteria, such as kind, attractive, funny, intelligent, and so on. There was no way I was going to marry a cloud or a tree, which might have happened if my decision had been truly, utterly random. How does this kind of contingent yet criterial selection of outcomes relate to the issue of free will? Concerning type 1 libertarian free will, we are in part responsible for our actions because we set these criteria versus others that we did not set. And we set these versus others because of the kind of agent we are when we set them. We are not completely responsible because we are not responsible for the particular way those criteria were met. Say we choose this escape route versus another, because this was a matter of chance or luck. So we are responsible for choosing an escape route, though not fully responsible for the particularities of choosing this escape route versus others that we might have picked had it not proven adequate first. So, to libertarian free will, we are in part responsible for our characters because we set these criteria for self-forming resolutions versus others that we did not set. And we set these versus others because of the kind of agent who we are. But we're not completely responsible for our characters because the initial characters or capacities we inherited were a matter of constitutive luck. And the particular way in which criteria we set were met, say we chose to be more honest for our New Year's resolution rather than less greedy, was a matter of present luck. So we are responsible for choosing to make a New Year's resolution to improve our characters, though not fully responsible for the particularities of choosing this character-forming resolution versus others that we might have picked had it not proven adequate first. But even if we are only in part responsible for our actions and characters, criterial causation offers both a grounding for libertarian free will and a degree of moral responsibility. In addition, criterial causation emphasizes that self-forming acts are not primarily the result of instantaneous torn decisions, like those of the philosopher acts are instead the result of a long-term cybernetic or error-correcting process that involves our willpower and our striving to fulfill a future envisioned self, which we might attain perhaps only after years of trying, failing, and then trying again. We ourselves are like the ancient sand heap paradox, according to which a single grain of sand is not a heap, nor is it a heap of sand if I add just one more grain of sand, and so on. On that account, even if we end up with 1,000,000 grains of sand, it cannot be a heap of sand because no instantaneous infinitesimal increment of turned that which was not a heap into a heap of sand. But at some point, integrating over all the tiny changes, we obviously do end up with a heap of sand. Likewise, with enough time and effort toward becoming a different kind of person, we can and we do become a different kind of person, even if the daily changes seem infinitesimal and of no consequence. Over years of practice, they integrate, and we have a new character, hopefully one with greater integrity. That is, integrating over long durations of tiny changes, we can succeed at willing to become a new kind of chooser. This capacity to choose to become a new kind of chooser, which I have called meta-free will, sets us apart from all other animals, I believe. It is a kind of freedom that is truly central to that which makes us human.
So does the mic work now? Okay, so I want to talk about this durational view of luck, this durational view of free will, in which we can envision a new future for ourselves. So, we in colloquial English, we talk about making your own luck. So what does this really mean? I'll just give an example. So this is the baby Jane Goodall, and they gave her a chimpanzee when she was a baby, and she loved this chimpanzee more than anything, and her dream was to go to Africa and work with chimpanzees her whole childhood. And she had this amazing mother who said, if you really want something, Jane, you work hard enough, you take advantage of opportunities, and you never give up, you will find a way. So Jane Goodall, as a girl, said, I want to go to Africa. I want to go to Africa. She was obsessed. And then she became a teenager, and she was from a poor family, so she couldn't go to university. She was working as a secretary. So now she's 20 years old. She didn't go to university, and people are saying, Jane, you have to forget going to Africa. It's crazy. You should find a nice man and marry him and have babies and be a normal woman. And she said, I don't want that. I want to go to Africa. So her mother was cleaning houses and said, okay, Jane, if you want to really go to Africa, I'll clean extra houses and we'll buy you a ticket. And so they bought together, they worked hard, and they saved up a one-way ticket to Mombasa. And then she was working on a farm somewhere near Nairobi. She had this vision that she wanted to work with animals in Africa, but she did not know how she would realize it. Then a friend said, well, you should actually contact this guy at the Museum of Natural History in Nairobi called Louis Leakey, who needs help. So initially he hired her as a secretary, and he's observing her. Now, Louis Leakey is the great paleoanthropologist who is surrounded by PhD people who want to be Louis Leakey. And he's looking for people who will go to live with chimpanzees and later gorillas with Diane Fossey. And so, let me say this. My family, she said, my family has very strong women. My mother never laughed at my dream of Africa, even though everyone else did, because we did not have any money, and because Africa was the dark continent, and because I was a girl. So anyway, she's working as a secretary at the Museum of Natural History, and Louis Leakey says to her, Miss Leakey, can you, Miss Goodall, can you imagine working with chimpanzees? And she says, yes, that is why I came here. So suddenly she's opportunistic in a good sense. He says, do you want to work with chimpanzees? And she says, yes. So then her mother came down also, and they went to the Gombe Preserve on the lake, I think the Lake Turkana, and they began living in the jungle. and her mother was cooking for her. And then every day Jane would go out into the forest. And initially the chimpanzees ignored her, and she would come and they would go away. And she would come and they would go away. And after months and months, finally, one female chimpanzee, I think named Flo, said, okay. And she went like this, and they touched. Now, this is not Flo, but so you might say, was Jane lucky? Well, this is another luck that realized in an instant. She had a vision from her childhood, and she was able to make it real. So luck, like trust or realizing a vision, can take years to mature. And this reminds me of a Chinese saying, which is, build trust 3 years, destroy trust 3 seconds. It's very hard to build trust. Trust is the foundation, though, of a flourishing life or a flourishing society. But it's very easy to destroy trust. So it's very easy to destroy dreams. So here she is as a young woman when she's first out in Africa, finally realizing her dream. I would say this is a kind of luck, but it's slow luck. She made this happen with her vision. Now, this is how she looks now. So she's near her end now. But this is really a courageous life. I got to meet her, so she was my childhood hero. Anyway, so here's a quote from Louis Pasteur. It was only because of my years of research that I was able to seize on the scientific potential that lay hidden in the natural phenomenon. Chance favors the prepared mind. This is a beautiful saying. Chance favors the prepared mind. So going back to Jane Goodall, she created a situation where she didn't know how she would work with animals in Africa, but she went to Africa. She called Louis Leakey. She got a job with Louis Leakey. And then he said, oh, do you want to work with the chimpanzees? Yes. So that's opportunism, but in the good sense. Usually we think of opportunism as negative. So how do we prepare our minds for future good luck? Well, through acts of imagination, like imagining to go to Africa, through reparameterizing our life, like actually going to Africa, and through seizing opportunities when they arise, like the benevolent opportunism when she called Louis Leakey and then he offered her a job. So benevolent opportunism doesn't happen by chance. We create the parameters such that this can arise. So it's a little bit like a garden. I think a lot of this slow luck is like a gardening, right? A garden doesn't happen by chance at an instant. You have to plan, you have to build the boxes, you have to put the soil in, you plant the seeds. So a lot of things in life are like a garden, you know. You reap what you sow, but also you do not reap what you do not sow. If there are weeds, you must pull them when they're small because, you know, problems only grow. If the plants get little insects, you pull them off, right? So many things in life are like a garden. We cultivate a certain kind of effort toward a goal. Now that might be to get a PhD, or it might be to find a partner for your life. So this is also another Chinese saying, right? Happiness for an hour, a bottle of wine. Happiness for a lifetime, a garden. All right, so I don't know how much time I have left because of all these technical difficulties, but I was going to talk about my science, but I was going to show another video. How are we doing on time? Okay, so I have another 40 minutes? Okay, good. So I'm going to show another video now about the neural bases of our transformation of our minds. So we have to switch back now to the sound.
And thereby choose to become a new kind of chooser in the future. There are many ways that our nervous system changes in response to what we do and what we think. We've already considered some, including meditation and other practices. There are many other feedback mechanisms whereby usage of a neural circuit changes its physical structure and thereby its function. In this section, we'll review some of the most basic ones and how they might operate at the level of neural circuits. One of the most common ways that we can transform our brains and minds, simply by willing it to be so, is that we can choose to learn something. Such learning is tied up with the slogan from Donald Hebb that neurons that fire together wire together. The idea is that when the firing of a presynaptic neuron immediately precedes the firing of a postsynaptic neuron, the synapse linking those two neurons will strengthen. It can strengthen in various ways. It can express more receptors, such as AMPA or NMDA receptors. It can involve greater neurotransmitter release, and in many cases, new dendritic spines can grow. Long-term potentiation, or LTP, is NMDA receptor dependent. Because the calcium that enters a neuron after NMDA receptors have opened triggers a whole cascade of events inside the cell, including protein synthesis that then goes into strengthening synapses in a process that takes hours, not milliseconds. LTP is especially strong following the high-frequency arrival of spikes, as occurs in bursting, that is most likely to trigger NMDA receptor opening. In contrast, when a presynaptic spike is not predictive of the timing of spiking of a postsynaptic neuron, the synapses linking these neurons tend to weaken in a process known as long-term depression. If it is correct that attention enhances burst transmission along epicircuits, then LTP may not just strengthen local synaptic connectivities between neuron pairs, it may strengthen whole epicircuits, just as many people walking over the grass can wear down new paths in it. For example, the bucket brigade of information processing set up by attending may become more efficient as short-term and temporal synaptic weight changes, such as the opening of NMDA receptors, get hardwired into long-term synaptic weight changes realized in structural reconfirmation of synapses. In this way, paying attention volitionally can alter neural wiring at the level of neurons and neural circuits. If we choose to learn something, we will, by practicing, make certain neurons fire together and thereby wire together. Another way that volitional practice can get hardwired into the nervous system is via enhanced myelinization. Recall that myelin functions a bit like the insulation around a cable, enhancing its ability to transmit information without signal loss. In the central nervous system, there is a kind of glial cell called an oligodendrocyte that wraps its arms around surrounding axons, as shown here, forming the myelin around axons. There's a feedback process such that the more action potentials go down a neighboring axon, the more oligodendrocytes will tend to wrap around it. This is a bit like muscles getting bigger the more you use them. In one study, my group compared Dartmouth students who learned Chinese in an intensive language course with a control group of students who did not learn a foreign language. Using a technique called diffusion tensor imaging, we were able to localize axons that had become more organized, probably because of increased myelination. The parts of the brain that are colored yellow and red here indicate axonal tracts that became more organized in the test group, presumably because they learned the foreign language. If we choose to learn something, say Chinese, we will, by practicing, make axonal paths involved in that processing become more efficient by virtue of stronger myelination. Experience, moreover, itself alters cortical organization throughout life. Plasticity in rat cortex is increased when the rats spend even a few days in an enriched environment. For example, Marion Diamond showed that cortical thickness differs in rats raised in an impoverished, standard, or enriched cage environment during their second month of life. The enriched group had a cage with extensive opportunities for social interaction and exploration of new objects. The standard group had fewer such opportunities, and the impoverished group had none. The enriched group had a significant cortical thickening relative to the standard group, while the impoverished group exhibited relative cortical thinning. There appear to be multiple factors that lead to increased cortical thickness. Neurons in rats with enriched experience showed increased number, cell body size, nuclear size, dendritic arborization and length, and the number of dendritic spines, synapses, and NMDA receptors. Increased neural growth factor release likely plays a role in this, as enriched brains exhibited increased levels of nerve growth factor mRNA. Such plasticity may be related to voluntary attention in particular, in that acetylcholine may be released from cholinergic basal forebrain nucleus neurons onto targeted cortical circuitry corresponding to the attended locus of information processing. This is thought to be a mechanism that realizes both increased alertness, enhanced neural processing of relevant inputs, and shows what can happen to a mature pyramidal cell depending on environment and experience. The path from A to C shows increased arborization with environmental enrichment, whereas the path from A to F shows increased atrophy with environmental impoverishment. It seems that experience, behavior, social interaction, stress, and other factors such as exercise, environmental quality, and nutrition influence brain chemistry and organization at the synaptic and dendritic level. We can harness this feedback process by taking charge of the environment in which our brains will operate in the future. We can populate our world with friends who will enrich our minds and social interactions and minimize contact with those who impoverish our life and social interactions. We can enhance our chances for exploration and novelty and minimize boredom and drudgery. Changing our environment to fit can enrich our neurons, so to speak, because of neural growth factors that are released when we have positive social interactions, when we pay attention, and when we exercise and explore. If you want to change your brain, then change your environment to enrich it. Plasticity realized in such mechanisms could play a more prominent role in adult learning as modifications are made to existing processing structures. Thus, at a minimum, the brain is analogous to our muscles. If we work out particular mental muscles, the neural substrate of those processes will get stronger. But the brain is more flexible than this. With practice, we can learn whole new classes of things, whether a new instrument, a new language, or hang gliding. We don't just strengthen existing muscles, we can effectively grow new mental muscles with effort and practice. For example, if we learn a new domain of expertise, whether the piano or hang gliding, we have increased the domains of our free choice. We could say that by cultivating new representational spaces and deepening existing ones, we increase the magnitude of our free will. Another way that learning alters our brains and minds is via chunking and automatization. Experience plays a central role in chunking of simpler representations and operations, which can in turn facilitate future volitional processes by allowing them to operate on these more complex operands. One possibility is that attention plays a role in converting criteria expressed at the level of working memory to a format expressed at the level of criterial decoders realized in dedicated neurons or groups of neurons. For example, it may take some attentional effort to convert a novel sight-read piano chord to a hand position, but with practice, this becomes chunked and automatized, such that one hardwires both the recognition of this novel pattern of notes and the motoric commands that realize a hand position without the need for attention. Consciousness, therefore, may not only exist so that relatively high-level representations in the form of qualia can be endogenously attended and otherwise operated upon, it may exist so that attention can chunk, automatize, and hardwire recognition of feature patterns and execute action patterns, automatizing these in order to make processing faster and potentially unconscious. Like a good teacher, attention might have the goal of making itself superfluous. If endogenous attention is thought of as the binding of representations in working memory, or as Ann Treisman put it, a feature glue, it is a glue that can harden, making future binding unnecessary. Attention might then be thought to operate in order to make itself necessary. To the extent that consciousness is the domain of present actual and potential future endogenous attentional bindings, one might say that one reason that we have consciousness is to make as much processing unconscious as possible. Endogenous attentional manipulation, while flexible, because any representation can be glued with any other, is slow and inefficient. Pre-glued or pre-compiled representations and motor sequences, while inflexible, are processed efficiently and rapidly. The structure of experience or consciousness will therefore change as we create more and more neo-primitive features. That is, as we master domains, we will process the world in terms of chunks and meta-chunks, whether perceptually, cognitively, or motorically. One very potent form of chunking that we can volitionally harness is habit formation. Basically, there are two modes of responding to inputs. One is slow, volitional, and flexible, which involves the conscious weighing of options. And the other is fast, automatized, inflexible, and largely unconscious, and is associated with habit formation. The conscious volitional system is realized in the cortical executive circuitry that we have considered so far, especially the frontal parietal control network. The habit formation system especially involves chunking action patterns, whether motoric, emotional, or cognitive, in sequences that are implemented as automatized units without the need for conscious deliberation. Central to this chunking process are the basal ganglia, shown here, and especially the dorsal areas, also known as the dorsal striatum, called the caudate nucleus and the putamen. The caudate nucleus, shown here, is the key structure in habit formation. This chunking is fostered or guided by reward signals realized in dopaminergic inputs from a midbrain structure, shown here, called the substantia nigra, in particular from that subnucleus called the substantia nigra pars compacta. We can volitionally harness our brain's propensity to form habits, or automatized action chunks, by consciously fostering the wiring up of later unconscious good habits. We can make sure to reward ourselves for behaviors that we want to make habitual. For example, let's say we want to make exercise a habit. Rather than think about it endlessly and hate ourselves for not starting, we can set things up in our lives so that we will go to the gym. We can buy a gym pass, set up a regular schedule with a gym partner who won't let us slack off. We can start small, say with 15 minutes a day, rather than start off with a marathon. We can build it into our schedule, consciously at first, until it becomes an automatized good habit. Exercising will naturally give us reward signals, and then we will get hooked or addicted in a good way. Knowing the power of operant conditioning or reward in shaping our behavior, and knowing that habit formation is natural, we can effectively shape ourselves towards certain automaticities of mind that we will to set in motion. At first, this might take conscious effort, but eventually will become so automatized as to become part and parcel of our very character.
Okay, so please switch it back. Testing, 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 testing. Okay, so really what I'm trying to do here is offer a neuroscience of what Aristotle talked about in the Nicomachean Ethics, where you envision a self and then you try to make this become a habit so that you become a person who cannot kill or rape simply because it's no longer part of your character. You have become cultivated. Now, time is limited, so I was going to go actually through a lot of the science, but I'll probably skip through some of this. But in this video, I talked about many mechanisms that allow an idea to turn into changes in the brain. So an idea of having a stronger body, you go to the gym, you get a stronger body. An idea of learning Chinese, you get a book, you learn Chinese, and this changes the brain. Of the many mechanisms I talked about, the one that I want to focus on is our ability to automatize patterns. So all of us did not come to the world speaking our mother language, and yet we automatize it now to such an extent that we're completely masterful. So how did this happen? So in my lab, we try to ask questions like, how do we master a domain? So we try to make questions as simple as possible, but not simpler, so we can ask, how does this work in the brain? So we don't know what kind of world we will be born into. You know, we might be born into a world that has mangoes and papayas. So we want to be able to master that taste. So to get this whole process off the ground, you need a basis set. Sweetness, sourness, saltiness, maybe 5 basic dimensions. If you're born into a world that has mangoes, you want to create a new primitive, mango detection, pineapple detection. And then later, when you have mastered these complex combinations, you can taste a complex curry and say, oh, I taste coconut and pineapple and mango. So you did not come to the world with mango detectors, but you created them through exposure and practice. Now, if you're born in Greenland, where they don't have mangoes, you'll create different expertise. You might say, walrus fat tastes much better than narwhal fat, you know, and you'll become expert in a different domain. So you're born with a basic set of feature detectors, but you must create combinations of features in order to create mastery so that you can recognize a fish or an orange. So in our culture, some people master things. Here's Vladimir Horowitz, he mastered the piano. Here's Michael Jordan, he mastered basketball. They did not come to the world playing the piano, or well, maybe Michael Jordan came to the world playing basketball, but they had great genetic potential, but that alone is not enough, right? There's nothing more common in the world than unrealized potential. And most children, most babies have incredible potential. And they were able to realize it because they had people who helped them and scaffolded them up. And they practiced until everything became automatized and they became masters. So how does this start? What is mastery? Well, we start with unconscious incompetence. We don't even know that we don't know. We're completely ignorant. And then we become conscious of our incompetence. We know, okay, I don't know how to ride a bicycle. Then we become consciously competent. We have to pay attention. We're paying a lot of attention, but then the attention acts like a glue and it hardens, and then we automatize lots of things, and then we become unconsciously competent. We can ride a bicycle without thinking about it. Now, this applies to motoric things, but I want to argue that this interaction between what we choose to pay attention to affects what we automatize. And if we choose to attend visual patterns, we will automatize visual patterns. If we choose to attend anything, we can automatize it and become masterful. So I will go through some experiments that try to ask this question: how do we chunk? Okay, so let's start with the beginning. This is my part of my lab. We do experiments. So this is built on a kind of research program from before called perceptual learning. That field argued that we have the ability to learn basic features at a given location, say in the retinotopic field, and we automatize it unconsciously. What I'm talking about is not perceptual learning. It's a kind of more advanced learning, which I will call conjunction learning, because we're conjoining two features. So let me try to give an example of this. So I would like you to look at the screen, and I want you to clap when you see the oddball. So in this case, the oddball will be something colored differently. Ready? Okay, so that's pretty quick. Now try again. Okay, now I'll give you a different task. You have to find the thing that's green and the shape of an L. Now in this case, it's much harder because you'll find it's here. Why is this hard? Because this is a conjunction of two features. It's this shape and green. But the problem is that there are many green things and there are many L-shaped things. So the only way to get a unique conjoining is to pay attention to this location. So in this situation, the duration to find the target depends on how many distractors there are. The more distractors, it takes longer because we're moving our attention around like this to try to find it. But in this case, where there's only one green thing, now find the same object. Well, this is easy, right? Boom. So in this case, it doesn't matter how many distractors there are, the reaction time is flat. So this search slope from being difficult to being flat is what I'm going to talk about. Okay, so here, this is easy, right? Boom. You can clap if you want. Now I want you to find the green vertical one. So this is a conjunction. This is harder. So this is here, right? And so this is more difficult because there are many vertical things and there are many green things. So what makes it unique is the combination, and you have to attend to this location to bind it. Okay, now this is very difficult. Where's the oddball here? Well, they're all red on the right, except one is red on the left. So it's up here. So this is very difficult. But the question is, can we automatize something difficult like this and become masterful at seeing this automatically? Now find the oddball here. Can you find it? So in this case, it is here. Now, I'll show you something interesting. Now I want you to find the oddball here. Where's the number 5? So this should be faster. It's here because you have automatized seeing 5 among 2. a lot in your life. So, but this is the same as this. It's just rotated 90 degrees. So, okay, so we can learn new feature conjunctions. We can choose to attend to anything arbitrary and chunk it. And with practice, we can learn it. So can you learn something difficult like this? And then we'll do also a motion version. So I want you to find this target, which is the one on the left. Okay, find the target. Can you find it? So this is difficult. It's actually here. Try again. It's like popcorn. Okay, it's here. So the question is, can it be automatized? So because you're all beginners in this task, your search slopes would be like this with the number of distractors. But with practice, the question is, does the search slope become this? Here's another example. Find the ball. Right. Okay, and then you get that's many, and this is a few. So basically, we can vary the number of stimuli, and we can look at the reaction time. Right, and so if right, so here's two subjects, right? So on day one, they have search slopes like this. It's very hard for them to find it. But after 16 days of training, it pops out. They're like, oh yeah, it's there. So they have automatized a detector for that target that they did not have before. So this is typical data with many days of training. So your search slopes go from this, difficult, to automatic. And your accuracy improves. So, but what is actually being learned here, right? So if you have people find the oddball in this situation, over many days, they get better and better, and their search slopes get flatter and flatter until finally it's almost like pop out. They're like, oh yeah, it's there. Oh, it's there. Now, what if we, is it that, are they simply learning a task? Maybe they're just getting better at the task. So if you look at that, well, there is some learning of the task, but if in this case, they're learning to find an L among T's. So there is some task learning, but basically it's quite specific to what they learn. Okay, so here, some typical data. It's not, I think there's an internet problem. I think the internet is very slow, so I'm not doing that. Okay, so basically, what people are learning is quite flexible, right? So they learn the vertical case, but it transfers to the horizontal case. So I can take this and rotate it, right? So their search slopes go from very difficult and slow with the increasing number of distractors to very fast with many days of training. And this transfers to new situations. But if you go back to the reverse, you replace targets with distractors and distractors with targets, it becomes very difficult again. Okay, so is it learning at a specific retinotopic location, right? So after many days of practice, people get much better. They can find it rapidly. Does it transfer to new locations? Yes. So what exactly is being learned? And where in the brain is this being learned? So to ask those questions, we want to understand what exactly is being learned. So to create this situation, we have to have people learn a particular target. So there's a delay between when I see it here. So there's something wrong with the internet. It's very slow. Okay. So if people learn this target among these distractors, they become very, very good, right? They become almost instantaneous with practice after whatever, 7 days of practicing for 1 hour every day. So initially they have to pay attention, and then at the end they're like, oh, it's there. But what happens if you embed the old target with a new distractor, or the old distractor with a new target, right? So the question is, what is actually learned? Are you learning to glue together the target, or are you learning to glue together the distractors, or both? And so to test this, we need to go to a new situation where we combine the old distractor with new targets, or the old target with new distractors. And so this is a little complicated, but basically we're asking, what is learned? Are you learning what your target is, or the distractors? So there's different situations, but basically the bottom line is that we learn both the target and the distractors, right? So mastery can come at a price, because we glue together what we attend, but we also learn what to ignore. So let me give, basically we learn not only the target, but the target and the distractors. And so we have to learn what is the figure and what is the ground. We learn what we attend, and we also learn what we ignore. So this leads to a kind of problem. Let me give you a real world example, right? So they found in Austria, on the Austrian-Italian border, they found a 5,000-year-old mummy named Ötzi, who probably looked like the guy on the top right. And the medical doctor examined this body for weeks, and they did many CT scans to try to understand what happened to this man 5,000 years ago. And then they did an X-ray, and the daughter of the X-ray technician said, "But Papa, what is that?" And they said, "Oh, that's an arrow." And then they went back and looked at the CT scans, and they said, "Well, of course, there's an arrow. We didn't see it." Right? So expertise can make you blind, because you have chunked together, only what is important, and you have actually actively created ignoring of what is irrelevant. So there is, I think, something like beginner's luck, where you're not blinded by your expertise. Okay. So I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip a lot of the next part. How are we doing on time? Okay. So in this section, I'm just pointing out that most of the features we learn are dynamic. They're not just combinations of red and green, or, and so we're able to process features over time to get structure, or we're able to process features over time to even get human bodies. So in this case, we created features that were moving. So very simple dots. They could either move like this, or they could move like this. So now you're trying to find that target among those distractors. So let's see if you can do it. Can you find that target? It's not easy, right? The answer is this one. So this is unique. So for you, because you're beginners, this is very difficult. But here what we did is we train people, and people get better and better. And so their search slopes are very slow in the beginning, and then they go whoop, and after 1 week of training, they say, "Oh yeah, it's there, it's there." They become experts in binding these features together into new objects. So then we ask, okay, what are people actually learning though, right? Are they just learning to do this task? And so we did other experiments to try to figure out what people are actually mastering. So are they learning the task? Well, if we do this, they learn that target among those distractors. Well, we can simply turn it upside down. So what was the distractor is now the target. If they're only learning the task, they should be equally good at this. But if you look at this, after a week of training, they get much faster. But if you flip it upside down, they're slow again. Right, so they're not just learning the task. Okay, what are they actually learning? Are they learning motion direction? Right, so we can have them learn this, and then we test with the opposite direction. And so in this case, you have to find the target. Going in the opposite direction is actually here. So for you, this is difficult because you have not trained. So in this case, we made it go in different directions, and it transfers. So people learn this, but it's also good for this. So it's not a simple combination of low-level features that what the people are learning. How about speed? Well, you can do, make it slower, it transfers. You can make it faster, it transfers. So they have automatized finding this, then they can also find this or this. What about shape? Are they learning shape? If they train on this for a week, can they do that? And the answer is, so now you have to find the target. This is difficult. It's this one. So this is almost impossible for you because you have not trained. So if they get faster and faster after a week until it's obvious where it is, does it transfer? It transfers, right? So it seems like, okay, I'm going to skip ahead a bit just to save time. But basically, it seems that people can generalize. They can learn something and then generalize. So for example, if you learn to drive a car, you can apply this to driving a bus. So the automaticity transfers to some extent. Okay, I'm going to go faster now because we're running out of time. I'm just going to skip all this. I'm going to skip all this brain stuff because I think we're running out of time. Let me just talk about this study. So then there are some people who, when they learn something new, they think, wow, that's amazing, right? And other people, they don't care, right? So there's a difference. Some people have a big reward signal from identical input. So what we did is we did a study where people had to solve a math problem, really boring. And we looked at how much reward-like activity they had in these reward centers. This red area is called the caudate. And we predicted that people who have a big reward signal will learn faster. Gabriel, how am I doing on time? Okay. Okay. Yeah. Well, I could talk for another hour, so I won't do that. But anyway, but the bottom line is that people who have a very reactive reward system learn faster. So I think one lesson of this, and I'll skip all this. So one aspect of free will, and this is the Aristotelian program, is that we can use volition, including volitional attention, to glue together certain kinds of expertise, and that becomes automatized. So attention is like a good teacher. It makes itself unnecessary. So attention is like a glue, but it hardens, and this becomes part of our unconscious processing. And so there's a beautiful interaction between two systems. You've heard about, there's the habit system and there's the volitional system. But the volitional system turns things into habits. And we have some control over what we decide we will automatize. Okay, so we talked about this. So I think this applies to life, right? We should look at what we love to do. People are very different. Some people love engineering, some people love working with children. And it makes sense to chunk or automatize that which we love, because this will be what we naturally can become a master at. Like someone like me who has low musical talent, I have to work very hard to reach a basic level. But somebody who has a lot of talent, boom, they can do it very quickly. So I'm going to skip all this because we're running out of time. But basically, none of us came to the world experts in anything. And we all became experts at our mother language. We all mastered many things like recognizing a stop sign. But in a way, this is all passive through exposure, but we can also choose to become masterful at something. Now, it helps if you have a family and a culture that fosters your mastery. But even if you come from a very impoverished background culturally where nobody helped you, you still can say, no, I'm going to choose to learn Mandarin, or I'm going to choose, and then you work, and then you can do it. So this kind of chunking that we're studying in the lab affords mastery. Mastery comes through automatization. And then the question is, can we automatize things of more importance, like our character? So it all starts out with basic feature detectors, like shape and color. But from this, we can go to very complicated things, like how to drive a car or how to play the violin. And so free will has this aspect where we can take our potential and shape it to some extent. Right? All right. So I'm going to skip all this. There's some experiments we're doing in Germany. Blah, blah, blah. Too much. Okay. I was going to show another movie, but I think we're running out of time. How much time do we have? Yeah, I mean, we have not officially just finished your time, but we have a lot of time overall. Okay, well, I was going to show another movie, but basically, I want to talk about the question of, can we automatize aspects of our decision-making and character? I'm going to skip this. All right, maybe I'll show this.
In this segment, we'll consider how a neuroscientist views self-forming decisions and acts. Here I'll lay out in broad strokes the empirical view of what is known, and where we need to go from here to nail down the existence of a human capacity to change human character, and to determine how it might work in the brain. Since the majority of self-forming resolutions that people will start trying to live up to once they make a New Year's resolution involve improving self-control and becoming more virtuous, I'll focus here on self-control and how it may be learned. A corporation, government, military, or even an ant colony will express hierarchy, decision-making modularity, and levels of mid-level control. It would be debilitatingly slow and inefficient if a soldier, for example, had to continually ask the president where he should shoot his bullets. Rather, higher levels can play a role in training up mid- and lower-level managers, place constraints on their permissible decision-making, then allow them to decide themselves appropriately, since they, after all, know local conditions best. Because of the need for efficiency and speed, information processing systems tend to evolve automatized middle levels of control. The mind is likely no exception. Yet, psychological accounts of mental control emphasize, at one extreme, automatic sensory motor control, and on the other, effortful attentional control. Modern accounts of self-control focus primarily on the role of the effortful exertion of will, when thought of as a verb, or willpower, when thought of as a noun or limited resource, in exercising self-control. Relatively few researchers have focused on mid-levels of control or the automatization of self-control. In contrast, Aristotle said, "We become that which we do every day. Excellence is not a virtue, but a habit." He emphasized that virtue emerges over time as the good habits or automaticities of thought and action develop through the practice of effortful self-control. With practice, that which started out as effortful becomes effortless. We come to automatize certain kinds of moral behavior and decision-making that we call having good character. Can the brain sciences evaluate whether Aristotle's program is possible given how the brain learns? Volitional executive control is closely linked with endogenous attentional selection and maintenance on an object of interest, while ignoring distractors, with associated capacities of error detection, task planning, prioritization, and task switching. Executive control takes place in a mental workspace where operations manipulate and maintain operands, and is particularly associated with two dominant frontal control networks, a so-called cingulo-opercular network, centrally involved in task maintenance or staying on task, and a lateral prefrontal posterior parietal network for executing the operations of a voluntary task, which we call the dorsal attentional network. The former network has also been implicated in willpower and error detection, whereas the latter has also been implicated in voluntary attentional processing, mental imagery, and working memory. Here are some images from researchers who have made these claims. Here we see the cingulo-opercular network, and here we see the dorsal attentional network. If executive control is the volitional governing of one's mental operations, self-control is the subclass of executive control specifically involved in resisting first-order impulses and desires. Self-control refers to the capacity to govern one's thoughts and actions, particularly towards maximizing the fulfillment of one's long-term goals, principles, and second-order desires. Thus, self-control is often associated with resisting temptations and impulsive behaviors. But it's also involved in making oneself persist in doing tasks, such as filling out taxes, that one might not want to do in a first-order sense, and governing the emotions. A subset of frontal lobe regions appears to govern self-control abilities, and compromised function in these frontal areas can result in increased impulsivity, such as difficulty suppressing habitual responses or difficulty suppressing the distracting effects of external stimuli in order to stay on task. The most famous example of this is Phineas Gage. He was a responsible foreman working for a train track laying company, but one day, while tamping down the gunpowder, Alfred Nobel had not yet invented dynamite, it exploded and blasted his tamping iron through his brain, effectively knocking out his frontal lobes. He went from being able to govern his first-order desires to not being able to inhibit his baser desires and acts. He grabbed women and food as he wanted, got into fights, and so forth. So, in the absence of these amazing frontal lobes, we would all be Phineas Gage. These frontal lobes allow us to live, or at least try to live, according to our second-order or higher desires and goals. There are substantial individual differences in self-control. Given that self-control is centrally concerned with governing impulsivity, low self-control and impulsivity are regarded by some researchers as essentially equivalent constructs. However, measures of self-control and impulsivity are not perfectly anti-correlated. High scores on self-control and low scores on impulsivity questionnaires correlate weakly but significantly with performance on many tasks that load on executive function. In the famous marshmallow test, again, participants can either opt for a small reward immediately or a large reward later. The capacity to defer gratification on this test and self-control scores from questionnaires predict success in many domains later in life, including school, income, health, well-being, and relationship quality. People low in self-control are typically relatively high on impulsivity despite the lack of a perfect anti-correlation. High impulsivity is generally associated with negative life outcomes such as higher substance abuse, lower wealth, poorer health and relationships, and greater levels of aggression and recklessness. Psychological analysis reveals three main classes of impulsivity: motoric impulsivity, associated with acting in the absence of playing out the likely consequences of one's actions; attentional impulsivity, associated with high distractibility and intrusive thoughts; and non-planning impulsivity, which is associated with a relative disregard for the future, being focused on the present, poor planning, and a preference not to be mentally challenged. Less commonly appreciated are potentially positive aspects of impulsivity, such as spontaneity and speeded decision-making. Okay, sure, Phineas Gage was spontaneous and made decisions rashly, but who would really want to be Phineas Gage after his accident? Overall, it seems that impulsivity does not lead us to make decisions that maximize our long-term well-being. There has been a great deal of work on the automatization of motor sequences and on perceptual learning that effectively automatizes the detection of perceptual features and conjunctions of such features. There has been much less work on the automatization of cognitive decision-making operations, though it's clear that practice can lead to reduced attentional load in a task that is, at least initially, very attentionally demanding. the automatization of decision-making may draw more upon medial prefrontal areas involved in the cingulo-opercular circuit and less upon lateral prefrontal areas involved in the dorsal attentional network. That is, the automatization of task maintenance may place less load on the cingulo-opercular circuits known to be very active in tasks that involve active task maintenance and error detection. Initially, executive control and self-control in some new domain is likely to prove attentionally demanding, but as these processes become automatized, they likely become less so. As they become automatized to a point that they require virtually no voluntary attention, they may begin to seem effortless to a person, at which point we might consider such decision-making and self-control now a veritable part of that person's character. This may offer a neuroscientific understanding of the cultivation of Aristotelian good habits, particularly those associated with executive and self-control. Of particular interest are the implications for free will and ethics of automatized mid-level decision-making agents. For example, if a soldier who would never voluntarily choose to kill his comrades at the level of fully voluntary executive decisions has voluntarily practiced war games that have led to the wiring up of automatic decision-making agents in him that then decide to fire on enemy-like targets, in what sense is he responsible for, say, a friendly fire incident that results in his accidentally killing his comrades? He was on autopilot, so is he to blame? Well, yes, in a way, because he trained up this trigger-happy automaticity instead of one that would cause him to wait a moment before shooting at his comrades. I believe that if it can be shown that previously voluntary, attentionally demanding and effortful self-control and decision-making operations can be automatized, we can legitimately talk about the mechanisms of character reformation demanded by a libertarian free will, whereby we are capable of choosing to have a new kind of character in the future. With appropriate practice, we automatize decision-making such that we now have effectively automatized being a new kind of person. For example, if we were once a thief and have cultivated a new kind of decision-making in ourselves, we can eventually become a person who simply would not steal by default. This might not be the only way of reforming our nervous systems to become the kind of choosers we intend to become, but it is sufficient to prove the existence of one way to show that intentions and programs of training can reform character.
Okay, please put it back to the mic. Thank you. Yes, I'll just talk one more minute because we're running out of time. But basically, automatization has a bad name. We think of it, oh, it's unconscious, or I'm just a zombie, but really, it's not simply is it working? Yeah. The conscious systems, and in particular the executive control systems, play a role in what becomes automatized. And so I think an understudied problem is how we automatize and what we choose to automatize, and then the degree of responsibility we have for that which we have chosen in the past to automatize, even if in the moment, because it's automatic, we could not have chosen otherwise. Nonetheless, we chose to automatize, say, shooting rapidly. Attention doesn't just glue together features; it glues together cognitive operations that then become automatized. And so, we create sort of mid-level managers in our own nervous system. Okay. But sometimes this goes awry, like an alien hand syndrome. And yeah, okay, I'll skip. But in the moral domain, the extent to which these automatic agents that we have chosen in the past to wire up, this is an interesting question for people interested in free will. And I'm going to skip all this because we're running out of time. But I want to skip. But I want to end with a question, which is, what affords the kinds of transformations of character that Aristotle was pushing for in the Nicomachean Ethics? I think it's important to realize that it's not simply an individual challenge to reform ourselves. I think there are social aspects to this. Like if you happen to be born in a culture that furthers your development, then you'll have enormous benefits from that. Institutions also play a big role in our ability to reform ourselves and to chunk. So I guess I'll stop there and take questions. Sorry about all the, yeah, I'll stop there. All right. Thank you.
All right.